down. But one of the reasons they've fallen as quickly as they have, and the decline is about the fastest we've seen in a decade, has to do with the president's release of 180 million barrels of oil from the strategic reserves, complemented by another 60 million that he got from our global partners. That is in the mix. It's helping to increase the supply of oil. We've helped at the ports, we've helped with shipping, but we've got a lot more work to do. And some of it, by the way, really involves Congress helping to alleviate some really big pressure points in family budgets. And we can get into that, too, because I think that's part of the fix here.
Sure. Jared, as you well know, there was, whether or not it was economic analysis or a convenient and repetitive talking point from the White House for a good number of months, and the president said this repeatedly, inflation was transitory. It hasn't turned out to be that way. Did you miss something in that assessment?
I know that one of the things that we tried to do back then, maybe we didn't always do it, but we tried to be clear that we were talking, as we often do here, about what the consensus was among market forecasters, among the Federal Reserve. We're often going to be out here talking about what the economics community and forecast community calls it, and folks called the inflation as transitory at that time. And I think the view then was there were certain things that we certainly couldn't have known about. Obviously, Putin's invasion of Ukraine, some of the other strains of COVID that have come on, no one knew about them back then. But I think the problem with transitory, and I said this yesterday in the press briefing room, is that it was always quite ambiguous in terms of what is the time frame you're talking about. To some people, it means 2 weeks. To some, 2 months. To some economists, it means a long historical wave, a couple of years. But I think the way it probably still, I wouldn't use that word to be sure, but I think the way the concept still maybe has some relevance is think about cars, okay? Computer chips are still in short supply relative to the demand for cars, and that's why we need the CHIPS Act. Well, it's not that American companies forgot how to make cars, Major. It's that we have a pronounced supply shortage. We also have a domestic bill called CHIPS, which Senate Republicans have in the past supported. If they get this to the president's desk tomorrow, he could sign it, and it would help alleviate the pressure we've seen from this chip shortage, and that is been a real problem for auto production.
So let's go in the Wayback Machine just for a moment, if you'd be so kind, Jared. In February of 2021, as the administration, with your help and lots of others, was negotiating the American Rescue Plan, $2 trillion, you were on my show, The Takeout, and told me this when we talked about the potential risk of inflation. Let's listen.
Well, you have to differentiate between heat and overheat. The American Rescue Plan will add some much-needed heat to this economy. I don't believe it will lead to overheating. I think that risk is far smaller than the risk of not doing enough to vanquish the virus and provide people the help they need. If the inflation rate starts to rise more quickly than the Fed is comfortable with, they have lots of ammunition to deal with that. But I think the risks of going too big are far smaller than the risks of going too small.
Okay, Jared, the snarky thing for me at this moment would say, well, that didn't age well, as the kids would say. But I just want to say one thing before you get into it, because I'm going to give you a chance to answer this.
Sure.
For context, the time we did that interview, first-time claims for joblessness in America were 861,000. There were 10 million people who were unemployed. And the emphasis that you had was to increase job creation and lower unemployment, which has happened. Right. But you also said you can't overheat the economy, and if we do, the Fed has all the tools. That part did not appear to have worked out.
Well, you know, I kind of like what I said back then in the following sense. I think people were often saying, or people are often saying now, I had even forgotten some of that rhetoric that you just. So people kind of are saying now, the White House, you said this bill wasn't going to do anything regarding inflation. But as you just heard me say, I said that of course it's going to create some heat, by which I meant more economic activity, which is often associated with some price pressures. True, I said that there wouldn't be, that the risk of overheating had to be weighed against the risk of doing all these other measures. Now, you alluded to this, but let me get a little deeper into it. Totally appropriate to evaluate the inflationary climate we're in. The president has called it unacceptably high. It is our #1 domestic priority. So I'm not coming after you for that. But let's look at what we got. What I said back then was that there were real risks of doing too little. What were those risks? Well, we would almost certainly not have 9 million jobs over this president's watch. We would almost certainly not have an unemployment rate of 3.6%. We would surely not have lower child poverty. We would very likely have worse household balance sheets with diminished savings instead of the kind of excess savings that households now can dip into in this time of price pressures. So yes, there's considerable heat out there, and the Fed is moving against it, as I predicted that they would. But I think when you're talking about a trade-off, it's really important to look at both sides of that trade-off. Yes, we have headwinds from high inflation. We also have tailwinds from one of the strongest labor markets on record.
All right, so let's take the headwinds and the tailwinds, put them together. Is a recession coming our way?
So here's the thing about recessions. You are talking to an economist, so when it comes to that kind of a question, it's always a probabilistic answer. It's never 1-0. The only time you can say, yes, we're definitely in a recession is sometimes after that recession is over, because it takes the business cycle dating committee some time to look back at the data and tell you that's where you were. Right now, when we look back at quarters 1 and 2 of this year, the first half of the year, I don't see numbers that associate with recession. I think the likelihood that that will be called a recession is really quite low. Consumer spending, very strong. We know the committee looks at that. Payroll employment, historically strong. We know they look at that. Retail sales, very strong. So all of those in the first half of the year certainly smell non-recessionary to me, and I suspect to most other economists. Going forward, look, it is hard to look around this corner. Have risks increased? Of course they have. You have the Federal Reserve hiking into an elevated inflationary environment. But, and I got to this a second ago, one of the other pieces of that trade-off, one of the other legacies of the American Rescue Plan is that consumers and businesses have very solid financial balance sheets. By that I mean that one of the reasons we see a lot of travel today, a lot of spending today, folks economically pretty active, is because of a very strong labor market, American Rescue Plan, and elevated savings levels, also a rescue plan. So I think all of those factors have to be tallied into the mix.
Sure, and you would acknowledge, Jared, would you not, that real wages have not kept pace, that they have gone up, but inflation has gone up more, and that is a limiting factor economically for the very constituencies this White House promised during the 2020 campaign to most orient its economic policy toward?
There's no question that anytime that there's a decline in the real wage, that's the kind of thing that President Biden wants his economic team to work as hard as we can to reverse. Let me give you a couple more facts about that, though. If you look at the wages of some lower wage workers, that's actually where we've seen the fastest wage growth. If you look at leisure and hospitality, which includes restaurant workers, if you look at transportation and warehousing and some parts of the trucking sector, you'll actually see wages that are beating inflation. Why? Because when the job market is at full employment and we have an economy, we have a job market where certainly labor demand is historically high, the benefits of that redound most notably, most pronounced to the lowest wage workers. And we see some of that in this economy. Also, if you look at the aggregate compensation, that is, if you look at all the jobs times all the wages, so the aggregate trillions of dollars of compensation in this economy, that's been beating inflation as well. And that's why I said there is a very strong backdrop to this economy. It is a strong labor market generating strong aggregate compensation, and it is balance sheets where people have a level of savings. Not everybody. There's certainly some people who are hearing this who don't have the savings they need. We have to watch out for those folks. But on aggregate, those factors are creating a real buffer in this period of economic stress.
A key member of President Biden's economic team, Jared Bernstein, member of the Council of Economic Advisors. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
For more on the rest of the day's news on Capitol Hill, let me bring in Nicholas Wu. He's a congressional reporter for Politico. Nicholas, great to see you. The Associated Press reports President Biden plans to hold off on declaring a so-called climate emergency. Tell my audience what that is, why the delay, and what it would do if it were ever to happen.
So, given the dramatic effects of climate change that we're seeing around the world, there have been calls by some Democrats to declare a national emergency around climate to try to mobilize the resources of the federal government to combat the effects of climate change, especially as what appears to be the more ambitious attempts to pass climate legislation through Congress have stalled out. But at least for now, the White House doesn't seem to have much interest in declaring a climate emergency. But it's worth remembering this is all comes at a time where the Democratic legislative agenda is shrinking and shrinking. And so as a result, you're seeing these calls from more and more Democrats for the White House to go it alone and act on these sorts of issues, whether it's debt or climate or even immigration.
Nicholas, you walk the halls of Congress more frequently than I do, but even I know that West Virginia Democratic Senator Joe Manchin, not the Democrats' famous or favorite member of the Democratic Senatorial Caucus, less so even this week than the week before. What's his status within the party? How much of these recriminations affect him, if at all? And is there any room to continue negotiating?
When it comes to Senator Manchin, Democrats just don't have that much of a choice other than to work with him. Remember, it's still a 50-50 Senate. And so anything requires getting Manchin aboard. And so this is the risk for Democrats, right? If you push him too far, there is a fear that, you could lose him on any given issue, whether it is climate or what appears to be these plans to bring together some kind of social spending bill or a healthcare bill. The worst case scenario for Democrats would be if all of this comes to a head and if you were to leave the party. Now, it's said that he's a Democrat and he won't do that, but the fear is there.
For sure. So, as most people know, in a midterm election cycle, the legislative calendar is even shorter than it normally is. August recess is looming. What has a chance of getting done?
That's all kind of up in the air right now. There's a lot of different bills moving around Capitol Hill right now. Literally, as we're speaking, the House just voted to codify same-sex marriage into law. And that's something that, picked up a fair amount of Republican support here in the House. And, they might have a chance in the 50-50 Senate. So we'll have to wait and see. But there's still plenty else moving around in these last few weeks as both chambers sprint towards the recess. You have plans coalescing around a healthcare bill in the Senate. What's left of Democrats' bigger social spending bill, basically. There's government funding bills that still have to go through, and there's a whole lot going on. And there's only a couple of weeks left to do this, and they're going to try to jam everything through on the calendar.
Nicholas, on another topic, former President Jimmy Carter, Secretary of State James Baker have an op-ed out in the Wall Street Journal calling for reforming the Electoral Count Act to avoid another January 6th controversy. Remind us of why that's being scrutinized in the aftermath of January 6th.
So after January 6th, there was a big push legislatively to try to clarify the role of the vice president and to prevent these kinds of challenges to the electors that we saw on January 6th. Part of the case the January 6th committee has made is that basically many of the people that were at the Capitol and the former president himself did believe that there was a way for the vice president to overturn the election results that day by basically having these slates of electors submitted by the states rejected and introducing alternate ones that would have voted for Trump as president. And so what's happening in Congress now is there's a couple different parallel track routes to try to reform the Electoral Count Act. There's this bipartisan group over in the Senate that's expected to introduce its own legislation very soon to reform the Electoral Count Act. And on the House side, this is a key issue for the January 6th committee, which is expected to offer fixes to this in its final report sometime this fall, as as they'll stitch together legislative recommendations that may or may not eventually see the light of day.
Excellent. Nicholas Wu, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
President Vladimir Putin traveled to Iran today. It's his first foreign trip since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Putin met with Iran's President Raisi and Turkey's President Erdogan. Turkey is a member of NATO, who has backed Ukraine in defending itself from Russia's aggression. This is Putin's first face-to-face interaction with a NATO leader since Russia, in fact, invaded Ukraine in February. Two top agenda items: reaching a deal to resume grain exports from Ukraine and Syria's ongoing civil war. A Georgia Republican congressman is fighting a subpoena to have him testify in the state's election investigation. Why the Fulton County DA wants to speak to Representative Jody Hice in her investigation into whether former President Trump, interfered in Georgia in the 2020 election. Plus, Maryland voters are poised to pick nominees for governor, setting the stage for a November showdown. A look at the frontrunners to replace outgoing Republican Governor Larry Hogan. All this and more, you are streaming Red and Blue.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
You ready?
A generation of kids opens up on CBS Reports.
I just want to be like a regular kid.
Their world, their struggles, their voices.
What if I was white?
A lot of people like to call names and make you feel ashamed for being proud of who you are.
Now streaming Gender.
I did not realize that you could change your gender.
Realizing how you feel.
You can be a boy, sometimes you feel like a girl, sometimes you feel like both.
Redefining who you are.
Identify as trans.
Gender fluid.
Non-binary and queer.
Is the idea of gender a thing of the past?
And to be yourself, always, no matter what anyone says, I love you.
Are the kids all right? Gender. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers?
They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
Want to go someplace new? Yeah, you do.
See something new.
Learn something new.
Meet someone new. Nate B in the house.
There's always something new under the sun.
CBS Mornings, weekdays.
When weather is about to get extreme.
We're talking about hail, we're talking about tornadoes, damaging wind.
Every second counts.
Let's now take a look at what that really means to you.
That's why CBS News and the Weather Channel have come together to bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
We can show you what it's going to look like when the storms come through.
You'll see what will happen, where it will happen, before it does. Feel the forecast on CBS News. Time to get prepared.
People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
Yeah. We found it.
You're kidding me!
We got it. We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
Stories that inform, inspire, and brighten your day.
I've been waiting patiently for something like this.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream on the free CBS News app Tuesday mornings.
Georgia Republican Congressman Jody Hice was supposed to be in an Atlanta courtroom this morning in regards to Fulton County's investigation into former President Trump's potential interference in the 2020 election. But Hice challenged that subpoena and did so in federal court, where a judge is slated to hear the case next Monday. Atlanta Journal-Constitution reporter Tamar Hallerman is with me now. So Congressman Hice is quite clearly following South Carolina Republican Senator Lindsey Graham's move in fighting this subpoena. What do prosecutors want to hear from him in particular, Tamar?
Well, we're not sure exactly. Prosecutors haven't shared that information, but we have a good idea about what Congressman Heiss was up to in the aftermath of the November 2020 elections. He was one of the loudest proponents of the Stop the Steal movement here in Georgia. He backed a Texas lawsuit at the Supreme Court that would have invalidated Georgia's election results. He was involved in a December 2020 meeting at the White House with Rudy Giuliani, Mark Meadows, and others where they discussed appointing a slate of fake electors. And he also led the challenge on the floor of the U.S. House on January 6th to reject the certification of Georgia's Democratic electors.
So what argument are Heiss's lawyers making to suggest that he does not have to comply with this subpoena?
Well, there's a couple different ones. The first, they're pointing to the Constitution and the speech or debate clause, which bars members of Congress from having to testify under oath about any activities that they would have done, kind of doing the course of their official duties, stuff that they would have done on the House or Senate floor, in committee rooms, that sort of thing. His lawyer also argues in these filings that Heiss had a right and a duty to inform himself and his colleagues about any allegations related to the elections. They're linking it to his constitutional duty, to certify the elections, the Electoral College results on January 6th. So they said he did nothing wrong.
So Fulton County District Attorney Fonnie Willis has sent quote-unquote target letters to several Republican electors in Georgia, suggesting they're at risk of being indicted. Is that what that actually means, a target letter? And do we have any idea what charges?
We don't yet. So we know today, based on another legal filing, that the DA has sent target letters to all 16 of the Republicans who cast fake Electoral College votes in Georgia. And basically, it's a letter just informing them that they should lawyer up, that they're at risk of getting indicted in a case should she decide to move forward. The district attorney has not said what kinds of state charges could be on the table, but legal experts I've talked to have mentioned things like forgery, solicitation to commit election fraud, and potentially even a conspiracy or even a predicate act as part of a broader racketeering charge. Some of those are kind of broader items that the DA has mentioned, not necessarily specifically related to the Republican electors, but she has some choices to make should she decide that she wants to press charges.
Speaking of big choices to make, one of the biggest ones is whether the DA, Fonnie Willis, will subpoena former President Trump. Any insight there?
She's leaving it on the table. When I talked to her about 10 days ago, she said she's not ruling it out. And I guess we'll have to wait and see. She says anybody who may have knowledge about what went on in Georgia after the elections, she's open to subpoenaing them. That includes people in the White House, potentially somebody like White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows or anyone else. She really hasn't confirmed anything beyond what has already been issued. But the fact that she's already subpoenaed close allies of Donald Trump, folks like Lindsey Graham, folks like Rudy Giuliani, it shows that she's not afraid to kind of pierce that inner orbit of Donald Trump and his associates. So I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if she were to go that way.
So related to the ongoing turmoil and intrigue around elections and politics in Georgia, former Senator David Perdue, Republican, who recently lost his challenge to Governor Brian Kemp, gave an extended interview about that loss and his future. Big headlines?
Sure. I mean, the fact that he's willing to kind of back Brian Kemp, who he kind of levied this nasty primary challenge to. David Perdue ended up losing really terribly by about 50 points. Now he mentions he wants to unite the party to defeat Stacey Abrams. There's plenty of folks, especially in the orbit of Governor Brian Kemp, who said, David Perdue did the opposite by leveling this primary challenge. He also mentioned how he is going to stay involved in politics somehow. We don't really know what that will look like yet. I wonder how many opportunities he's going to get given how much he really angered Brian Kemp. And I'll be curious to see how out front he ends up being over the course of this election.
Tamar Hollerman of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Maryland voters are right now voting in several key primary races. Republican Governor Larry Hogan is forced to quit due to term limits in Maryland, and Democrats are hoping to press their 2-to-1 advantage in registered voters on way to victory. CBS News political reporter Aaron Navarro joins me now from Annapolis, Maryland. That's the capital. He's following Republican gubernatorial candidate Kelly Schultz today. Aaron, this Republican primary is, and we've seen this before, and it's a useful phrase, can't be used too many times when it actually is, a proxy war between two potential 2024 candidates. Can you talk about that?
Former President Trump has backed Delegate Dan Cox. This is someone who believes that the 2020 election was stolen and has called for a forensic audit of that election. Hogan, the outgoing governor, has backed his former Secretary of Commerce, Kelly Schulz. Now, both Hogan and Trump are potential candidates for president in 2024. Last week, Hogan was in New Hampshire, an early primary state. This year, Trump has been going around the nation and is in Arizona for a rally. That's another battleground state. But there's no love lost between Hogan and Trump. In his post leading up to tonight's primaries, Trump has gone after Hogan, and in a tele-rally for Dan Cox last week said, quote, "Anybody Hogan wants, frankly, I'd be against just on that basis alone," end quote. And while Schulz hasn't gone after Trump explicitly, her campaign has called Cox a, quote, "conspiracy nut." So that 2024 dynamic has definitely been playing out in this primary.
So, Aaron, there's something that's going on in Maryland. It's happened in a couple of other races. The Democratic Governors Association, let me repeat, the Democratic Governors Association has spent more than $1 million to boost Dan Cox. What is that strategy, and is there any risk of it backfiring?
Well, frankly, they see Cox as someone that they can beat in November. They spend more than $1 million on ads about Cox's Trump endorsement, boosting his conservative credentials, all because they see him as more vulnerable and the preferred candidate they want to run against in November. That strategy has been seen before in Pennsylvania, in the governor's race there, where Doug Mastriano won the nomination, and in Illinois, where State Senator Darren Bailey won that nomination. Both of those are candidates that believe that the 2020 election was stolen, and it could backfire. Mastriano has been down single digits to Josh Shapiro, a Democrat in Pennsylvania. And we saw it backfire in Colorado when Democrats spent money to try and boost their preferred Senate candidate in the Republican primary. And instead, they got Joe O'Dea, who on election night called himself the, quote, Republican Joe Manchin. So when you ask the DGA about this race and this approach, they say, look at the polls. Cox is led by single digits. We see him as the front runner. So we're looking to get the general election started early. We could see the strategy used in upcoming elections like Arizona and Michigan, which both have their primaries on August 2nd.
So we mentioned Larry Hogan, the Republican governor, not on the ballot, can't run. That has created a big opening for Democrats, and big openings always attract a lot of candidates. This Democratic primary field for governor, crowded. Who's the front runner, and what are you looking for tonight?
So there are 3 front runners per se. There are 10 candidates on the ballot, but 3 have been polling consistently over double digits. You have author Wes Moore, who has been backed by Oprah. You have former DNC chair Tom Perez, and you have a comptroller here that's been the comptroller for decades, Peter Franchot. And I would say what's been interesting about the primary is how candidates are talking about crime. Crime, especially when you look at a city like Baltimore, which has seen a rise in gun violence and robberies, is a top issue for voters here, even Democrats. And it's been interesting to see some of the candidates talk about how they would fix that. One candidate I didn't mention yet, former Attorney General Doug Gansler, has proposed adding 1,000 more police officers statewide. Other candidates have been talking about reallocating police budgets and taking a bit more of a holistic approach when it comes to police reform and crime. So that's been one interesting dynamic I've seen playing out in, as you said, this very crowded Democratic primary field.
So Maryland does not actually typically attract a lot of national attention, but this is an open seat race, and this is a bad environment everywhere in the United States. Every Democrat acknowledges that. Does Maryland have some potential to be kind of a surprise story in the larger November conversation?
So when you look at the Democratic map for governors, Maryland is one of 2 potential flips for the party this year. And as you mentioned, in a pretty tough political year, it's this and Massachusetts. If Hogan's candidate, Kelly Schulz, makes it through the primary, I'm expecting this race to be competitive. In November, Democrats have tried to take Larry Hogan out of office for the past 8 years. Kelly Schulz represents a lot of the same political character and policies that Hogan has, that has resonated across the aisle with Marylanders. If Dan Cox makes it through, I'm expecting this to be a little bit less competitive. But given this year, as you mentioned, well, we will see. We will see.
Coming to us from Annapolis, the state capital in Maryland, Aaron Navarro, thanks so very much. The National Archives wants to know how one of the country's premier law enforcement agencies lost text messages sent on and around January 6, 2021. The agency's explanation and what happens if those text messages can't be located. Plus, opening statements begin in the criminal trial against former Trump advisor Steve Bannon, the federal charges he faces after refusing for months to cooperate with the January 6th House Select Committee. You are streaming CBS News.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
You ready? A generation of kids opens up on CBS Reports.
I just want to be like a regular kid.
Their world, their struggles, their voices.
What if I was white?
A lot of people like to call names and make you feel ashamed for being proud of who you are.
Now streaming Gender.
I did not realize that you could change your gender.
Realizing how you feel.
You can be a boy, sometimes you feel like a girl, sometimes you feel like both.
Redefining who you are.
Identify as trans.
Gender fluid.
Non-binary and queer.
Is the idea of gender a thing of the past?
And to be yourself, always, no matter what anyone says, I love you.
Are the kids all right? Gender. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
Want to go someplace new? Yeah, you do.
See something new.
Learn something new.
Meet someone new. Nate B in the house.
There's always something new under the sun.
CBS Mornings, weekdays.
When weather is about to get extreme.
We're talking about hail, we're talking about tornadoes, damaging winds.
Every second counts.
Let's now take a look at what that really means to you.
That's why CBS News and the Weather Channel have come together to bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
We can show you what it's going to look like when the storms come through.
You'll see what will happen, where it will happen, before it does. Feel the forecast on CBS News. Time to get prepared.
People from every corner of America facing challenges.
Everyone is just looking for some type of connection.
Just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to help.
Coming together to find solutions.
We are going to do something about it.
Their stories are our stories.
Welcome to Eye on America.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
We have an inspiring story that started with a strange act of kindness.
Yeah. We found it.
You're kidding me!
We got it.
We share stories that lift you up and brighten your day.
The Uplift. Stream on the free CBS News app.
Stories that inform, inspire, and brighten your day.
I've been waiting patiently for something like this.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream on the free CBS News app Tuesday mornings.
Welcome back to Red and Blue. I'm Major Garrett, and here's a look at some of our top stories. The cost of food, housing, and other necessities continues to rise, and despite the concern from economics and other analysts, White House officials deny that a recession in America's future is inevitable. Plus, Steve Dettelbach has been sworn in as the first Senate-confirmed ATF director since 2015. He steps into this position as federal officials work to address growing public concern over mass gun violence and domestic extremism. And several states across the U.S. are on excessive heat alerts as temperatures soar to near triple digits. Health officials are encouraging people to stay hydrated, wear sunscreen, and limit time spent outdoors. Michael George has more from New York.
Across the nation, the heat is on.
When the heat is like this, everyone needs a way to have a backup plan.
Intense conditions are gripping parts of North Texas, where wildfires are scorching homes, and excessive heat warnings are in effect.
We have a pretty significant drought all across North and Central Texas.
And it's not just Texas. Nearly 40 million people in parts of California, Arizona, and the Central Plains are facing record temperatures.
We need a lot of rain for a lot of days.
In Arkansas, soaring temperatures on top of drought and inflation have producers lining up to sell their cattle.
Because of the cost of fertilizer, we didn't produce the hay that we normally would. So that's really put us in a really bad position now.
Here in the Northeast, temperatures are running 10 to 15 degrees above average with no relief in sight.
It's very difficult because my air conditioning broke, of course.
It's not easy, but it's better than the winter, and you got to enjoy it while it lasts.
The National Weather Service says climate patterns like La Nina are driving warmer and drier conditions north, which creates a drought and a so-called heat dome.
This is serious heat, and we're really concerned about
to stay hydrated, limit their time outdoors, and check in on elderly family members and neighbors who may be vulnerable. Michael George, CBS News, New York.
We're learning now about who will be appearing at Thursday's primetime House Select Committee hearing investigating the January 6th Capitol riot. Former National Security Council official Matthew Pottinger and White House Deputy Press Secretary Sarah Matthews, both of whom resigned just after the January 6th siege, will field questions from the committee. Meanwhile, the National Archives is asking the Secret Service to investigate what happened to the missing text messages from the week of that Capitol assault. The House Committee also issued a subpoena seeking those messages and other related records. For more, let us bring in CBS News congressional correspondent Nicole Killian. Nicole, great to see you. We haven't heard much from Matthews and Pottinger in video snippets in earlier hearings. So what is the committee hoping for now?
Yeah, that's right. Well, we have heard a little bit from him in hearings, mostly talking about that tweet that then President Trump put out in the midst of the riot, saying something to the effect of Mike Pence, referring to the vice president at the time, didn't have the courage to do what should be done. And so, we did hear in tape testimony earlier in this series of hearings, Matt Pottinger tell the committee that kind of in that moment is when he decided to resign. And I did have a chance to talk earlier today with Congresswoman Elaine Luria, who is one of the members of the Select Committee who is leading this panel. And she said that we will hear more from Matthew Pottinger about his decision to resign and why he felt more or less that it ran counter to his values in terms of, what he witnessed that day. We also expect to hear more, as you mentioned, from former Deputy Press Secretary Sarah Matthews, who also we've heard in recorded testimony referred to that same tweet, saying that she felt the former president was pouring gasoline on the fire by issuing that tweet about Mike Pence. And so, again, Congresswoman Luria telling me that Sarah Matthews will likely testify more about her role at the White House that day and what she witnessed.
Very good. The National Archives says it wants the Secret Service to investigate these deleted text messages that occurred around the time of this January 6th attack. The Secret Service pledged, quote, full cooperation with this review. First of all, Nicole, does Congress regard that, or the National Archives regard that as a credible response from the Secret Service? And does anyone have an idea what these messages, these text messages, might have been about or what they contained?
Well, I think from the members that we've talked to here on the Hill, both with the Select Committee and just in general with some of the other committees that have been briefed on this, is that they do want to know more information about what exactly happened here. We spoke a short time ago with Select Committee member Jamie Raskin, who said that he's not sure that the committee knows the full extent of, what may have happened with these messages, but that he's hopeful that there is perhaps some type of way or mechanism to retrieve them. But he also told one of our producers that he would be shocked and horrified if the destruction of these messages was overseen by a member of leadership within the Secret Service. So I think there's still a lot that remains to be determined as far as the National Archives is concerned. In its letter to the Department of Homeland Security and Secret Service, it did say that if any messages were improperly deleted, that the Secret Service has 30 calendar days to notify the archives and also needs to provide a report of what happened.
And Nicole, real quick, these text messages could illuminate conversations between members of the Secret Service, either about what the then President Trump did or didn't do, and I'm sure that's of interest, to put it mildly, to members of Congress.
Yeah, I mean, all we know in reference to these tweets is that, or text messages, I should say, is that they were from January 5th and January 6th. That is according to the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General, which initially flagged these missing messages. And so, of course, we know that the Secret Service was quite involved, especially on the day of January 6th. You know what some committee members have told me, for instance, they would like to learn more about, for instance, the Secret Service's role. Obviously, they were protecting the former president. We did hear a lot of that testimony from Cassidy Hutchinson before the panel about, what may have transpired in the presidential limo or the Beast following that rally. So that, we don't know if there are any messages connected or affiliated with that particular story or instance. There were also Secret Service agents who were with former Vice President Mike Pence when he was here in the Capitol. So, look, these potentially deleted messages could cover a range of things. At the end of the day, again, the Select Committee simply just wants to get to the bottom of what happened. And again, we do know from the Secret Service that they said that even if these messages in question may have been deleted, again, through some type of factory reset or migration that occurred throughout the agency, that it is exploring all possible avenues to try to get assistance in retrieving them, including trying to contact phone providers.
That could be an avenue. So the Select Committee subpoenaed Steve Bannon. He rejected that or didn't comply. The Justice Department then indicted him on contempt of Congress, and the first day of his trial was today. I'm not asking you to be a theater critic or a legal beagle, but in general, what transpired?
Well, look, this trial has gotten off to a bit of a slow start in the sense that it took the better part of a day and a half to seat a jury. Once that happened, opening arguments did take place earlier today, where both sides pretty much argued, again, in terms of these charges that Steve Bannon is facing in terms of contempt of Congress. Of course, in terms of the committee's position on this, and prosecutors, they say when Steve Bannon was subpoenaed, that was kind of a date certain that they expected his cooperation, whereas Bannon's team is arguing, well, look, Bannon's counsel was in conversation with the Select Committee, and so, in their view, it was more something where they felt it was a bit more negotiable. So we did hear, in addition to those opening arguments from both sides, there was a staffer from the House Select Committee who appeared in court today testifying on behalf of the prosecution, but that really seemed to anger Steve Bannon because as he exited the courtroom today, he really blasted the committee for putting forth this staffer, saying he wants to see a member of the Select Committee come before the court, someone like Chairman Benny Thompson, although earlier today we learned that Chairman Thompson has tested positive for coronavirus.
Lots of topics, lots of information. Nicole Killian, as always, thanks so much.
You bet.
We will be right back. You are streaming Red and Blue on CBS News.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
When weather is about to get extreme.
We're talking about hail, we're talking about tornadoes, damaging winds.
Every second counts.
Let's now take a look at what that really means to you.
That's why CBS News and the Weather Channel have come together to bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real.
We can show you what it's going to look like when the storms come through.
You'll see what will happen, where it will happen, before it does. Feel the forecast on CBS News. Time to get prepared.
I'm Nora O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Nora O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
We will witness yet another moment in history.
A prominent scholar on economics, demographics, and politics is ditching his left-leaning think tank for a new home on the right. He left the Center for American Progress to join the American Enterprise Institute. Marie Teixeira told Politico that his views have not and will not change with this new gig. Marie Teixeira joins me now. Now, folks, we would not ordinarily do a segment on a scholar from a think tank changing addresses, but we're doing this because it might be emblematic of something bigger, of more interest. So, Marie, you told Politico that your experience at the Center for American Progress sent you, quote, running screaming from the left. What did you mean by that?
Well, what I meant by that isn't just experience at the Center for American Progress. It's broader than that. It's broader than that. It includes the center left as a whole. It includes the institutional left in Washington, the infrastructure in and around the Democratic Party, which I found to be rather uninterested in open debate about a lot of the key political questions surrounding coalition building in the United States, issues about race and crime and immigration and gender and trans issues, a whole variety of things that I feel are very difficult issues for the Democrats, are costing them votes, are interfering with the ability of the Democrats to build a coalition and pursue the kind of governance they want. And I found it was very, very difficult to have those conversations in the context of the Center for American Progress, or indeed most other left think tanks. I think that there's sort of an epistemic closure about a lot of issues on the left that the left used to accuse the right about, but now I think it's pretty common on the left. And one thing I like about AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, is I think they're very open to having conversations with people who they disagree with, who have a different perspective on things. And they're genuine scholars. They have they seek to reason from logic and evidence, which is my bias. And I feel like they stand in some ways for small L liberal values in a way I think the left is a little bit lost track of. So I just feel it's a better home for the kinds of things I'm interested in. Now, it's not the case that I agree with everything people at AEI says. I certainly don't consider myself on the right in general. And I find a lot of what comes out of the more intransigent wing of the Republican Party, particularly in and around Trump, to be very unpromising and off-putting and just plain wrong. But I think wisdom should put us in the direction of having people from all parts of the political spectrum have open and interesting and evidence-based dialogues, and that's what I'm after.
Right. Now, Rory doesn't need me to say this, but I've been reading his stuff for years, and he really is one of the most brilliant observers because he talks about something I think is fundamental to politics in our country, always has been, which is class and economics. He doesn't ignore race, he doesn't ignore gender, but he really does look at things in terms of changing demographics and how economics flows through that. And if I hear you, Rory, you're saying that on the left now there's this hardening around notions of race and gender being determinative and a de-emphasis on class and economics. And you not only find that intellectually faulty, but sort of constricting. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, you're getting that exactly right. I mean, if you look at the fundamentals of the way our system works and the advantages and disadvantages people have, I've always believed and believe today, these are fundamentally questions of class, of economic advantage and disadvantage. And I think that people on the left have always stood for putting those issues first and foremost and concentrating on them and trying to lift up as many people as they can with effective programs, give everyone an equal opportunity to achieve in the society and overcome their disadvantages. And I think that emphasis on class has really gone a-begging to a large extent in and around the Democratic Party today, particularly its sort of think tank and advocacy group wing, where it's become much more fashionable to not only talk a lot about race and gender, but in fact, to actually take universal programs which uplift people from the working class and put them in racial equity terms, which I think is a big political mistake, and I think undersells the great impact that these programs can have on working class people of all races. And that's really the alarm bell for me that really sent me off in this direction is when I look at the political demographics of the country and I see the Democrats bleeding working class votes, and they're historically the party of the working class, and we see it extending from white working class voters to non-white working class voters, especially Hispanic working class voters. Well, I become very worried. I think, the Democrats have lost their way. I think they're not cognizant of the political realities of the country and the priorities of what we might call normie voters. And I think that's very sad, and I think it's very unproductive.
And Marie, does your research tell you that working class voters of all races either find it either insulting or conversationally limiting to have people on the Democratic side talk to them relentlessly about identity and gender?
Absolutely. These are not their priorities. I think we know that from a lot of survey data. We know that from common sense. We know that from talking to these people. They live in the real world. They want to advance materially. They want upward mobility. They want their communities to be in good shape for their kids to have a better life. They want the opportunity to do better in their own lives and making themselves more comfortable and so on. And these kind of relatively boutique issues around identity politics, while very important to younger, liberal, college-educated folks who go into a lot of these groups in and around the Democrats, and also to some extent, one might argue, control the commanding heights of cultural production in this country. These are not their priorities. They're just not. They may, in fact, be moderate to, friendly to a lot of changes that have taken place in America along the lines of more tolerance and more opportunity for people of all races and genders. I actually don't think this stuff is very controversial anymore, but they do find it off-putting when they see a lot of emphasis and talk from the Democrats about how, for example, every white person has white privilege. We live in a white supremacist society. I mean, this is not the way they think about the world. Echelon Insights recently did a survey where they asked people about essentially, what do you think best describes the country that is structurally and intrinsically racist throughout its institutions, or racism is primarily a matter of the views of individuals and racist practices that they pursue. And Hispanics overwhelmingly were on the side that said, well, I think it's probably mostly an individual thing. But if you looked at the views of white progressives, the very kind of people who populate the sort of infrastructure of the Democratic Party, it was like 90% say this is a matter of what we might call structural racism, and it doesn't stem from individuals. And there's a variety of different things like this, which just show very clearly that the values held by the people who are sort of guiding the brand and defining the brand of the Democratic Party are very different from where working class voters are coming from. And it's not just white working class voters anymore, it's non-white working class voters as well. And I think that, again, is something that should send alarm bells ringing throughout the Democratic Party, because you cannot build an effective coalition on the basis of increasing your share year over year among the most educated and liberal parts of the population while you lose working class votes, especially given the political geography of this country. And, which is decisive. Rural areas, Midwest states, they're all extremely important to the outcomes Democrats are interested in.
Indeed they are. Rui Teixeira, thank you so much for the conversation. Appreciate it.
It's been great.
We're going to take a quick break, and that means you have a couple of minutes to download the free CBS News app on all your devices. You can catch live local coverage from across the country from all of our CBS stations. And while you are at it, check out Paramount Plus, where we've got a mountain. Yes, it's a metaphor, but run with it. A mountain of content for you to stream there as well. That includes your favorite shows, movies, and sports.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS. Go to the ends of the earth.
Right now. We got something crazy.
And reach for the stars.
Here we are.
Time.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun.
But wait, there's more.
Experience thought-provoking,
I'm open to the idea of being a human being.
innovative, and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday Morning.
You ready?
A generation of kids opens up on CBS Reports.
I just want to be like a regular kid.
Their world, their struggles, their voices.
What if I was white?
A lot of people like to call names and make you feel ashamed for being proud of who you are.
Now streaming racism.
I feel like it's just a war zone between all different races.
Will this generation continue the problem?
The kids pushed them away and didn't want them to be there because of their race.
Or be the solution?
We just need to keep raising our voices. We're all human and we don't deserve that type of treatment just because of how we look.
Are the kids all right? Racism, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Want to go someplace new? Yeah, you do.
See something new.
Learn something new.
Meet someone new. Nate B in the house.
There's always something new under the sun.
CBS Mornings, weekdays.
President Biden welcomed Ukraine's First Lady to the White House Tuesday. Olena Zelenska met with First Lady Jill Biden to discuss the human toll of the war in Ukraine. She is also set to address Congress Wednesday. Zelenska met with Secretary of State Antony Blinken Monday. After the meeting, Blinken reiterated support for Ukraine in a tweet, saying the U.S. is, quote, committed to helping the people of Ukraine defend themselves from Russia, secure justice, and rebuild their country. The National Trust for Historic Preservation has awarded $3 million in grants to preserve areas important to African American history. Part of the funds will go toward restoring the Chicago home of Emmett Till, a black teen who was murdered in 1955 for allegedly whistling at a white woman. Grant funds will also be used to preserve the first black Masonic Lodge in North Carolina, a historic black school in Oklahoma, and African American cemeteries in Pennsylvania and South Carolina. Well, that does it for today. You can stream Red and Blue Monday to Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern. And a reminder, if you want to watch previous episodes of the program, you can see them anytime on the CBS News website. Just head to cbsnews.com/red and blue.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS. Go to the ends of the earth.
Right now.
We got something crazy.
And reach for the stars.
Here we are.
Time.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun.
But wait, there's more.
Experience thought-provoking,
Welcome to the idea of being a human being.
innovative, and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday Morning.
You ready?
A generation of kids opens up on CBS Reports.
I just want to be like a regular kid.
Their world, their struggles, their voices.
What if I was white?
A lot of people like to call names and make you feel ashamed for being proud of who you are.
Now streaming racism.
I feel like it's just a war zone between all different races.
Will this generation